Good afternoon, everybody. So this is the Reading Wars presented by the New York Review of Books, moderated by Daniel Mendelsohn. We have today on the panel Francine Prose, Laura Marsh, and Julian Lucas.
Thank you. I'm Daniel Mendelsohn. The first thing I have to say is I left my reading glasses on the train, and they just handed me a moderator package, and it says, please read this statement at the beginning. So I think it says, good morning, afternoon. I'm Daniel Mendelsohn. Before we begin, I would like to let you know that books by the authors in the program can be purchased from the Greenlight bookstore outside on the plaza. Authors will be signing their books immediately following this program in the rotunda downstairs. Authors at the conclusion of the program, please go directly to your signing tables. And at the conclusion of this program, we ask everyone to leave their seats so that the next audience can be seated. Okay, so that is the miracle of bifocal contact lenses. We're here today to talk about a difficult and controversial subject, and I just can see from the size of the audience, this is obviously a question that's on many people's minds right now. And I want to frame some of the issues at the outset by observing. I think we have, what's going on is there's a sort of a two-pronged problem. This is a moment that's particularly fraught with respect to reading and writing, and I should also say teaching literature, as I know from my own personal experience. There are obviously heated debates going on right now at all levels of American culture, certainly, about what we read, how books are taught, and so forth. The currents seem to be coming from two sides. On the one hand, I'll call it the right hand, as we know, there are increasingly efforts to ban books from schools and public libraries. Everybody, I'm sure, is aware of this. It's been very much in the news. All the attention, for example, about what's going on in Florida, as we know. The American Library Association has reported there are almost 1,300 demands to restrict or ban library materials in 2022, the highest number ever reported. As far as schools go, PEN America, which has been monitoring, for obvious reasons, has been monitoring these campaigns, has reported there have been 3,300 book bans in the previous year. And that represents 1,500 unique titles. It's clear that when you look at, to some extent, when one looks at a map of where these things are happening, it looks like an electoral map. 40% of all the banning and desire to ban is happening in Florida. The next highest number is in Texas, Missouri, Utah, and Pennsylvania. However, before we leap to any patting ourselves on the shoulder, it's worth saying that 2/3 of the states that are calling for bans or legislating in various ways to make bans easier are red states, but 1/3 are blue states. So that's also an interesting phenomenon. I think it's worth keeping in mind. As we know, there have been legislative activities that are supporting the suppression of books and of writers and of different kinds of teaching. Typically, the emphasis is on getting rid of the teaching of books that seem to interrupt a kind of, or dispute a kind of idealized version of American history, as we know. We've seen those. There have been, beyond the banning of books, and this is one of the things I'm very interested in hearing about today from the panels, there's, I think, a larger trend to legislate thinking and teaching. We know that, again, in Florida, legislation to ban the teaching of critical race theory, ban books having teaching of sexuality. I think there's the larger trend speaks to using political power to police thought more generally in different ways, some of them insidious. For example, states where legislatures are abolishing tenure, which is a not too covert way of exercising control of what professors think and teach. So that is on the left, on the right hand. On the left hand, so to speak, there's a different kind of thing going on, which has given cause for concern just as much to a lot of people. So a lot of this revolves around the way in which contemporary sensitivities about issues of gender, race, sexuality are triggering, no pun intended, a desire to rewrite books in some case, to edit offensive materials out of different books. It expresses itself, I think, in a healthy way in a desire to rethink the canon, to think about what canons are out to. There's been a call to expunge certain texts which no longer suit our tastes from canons. There are obviously debates about words which are offensive. Mark Twain has always been on the list of problematic, let's call it, American writers, but there seems to be a tremendous explosion in the sort of examination of texts for offensive kinds of words. There was as I'm sure you're aware, there was a recent controversy about Roald Dahl's books being some of these beloved children's classics being edited by so-called sensitivity readers. There is also, many people perceive, also an attempt to police thought coming from this direction. There was just an article in the Times, I'm sure many of you saw, about the pledge that about half of the big universities in this country are demanding that professors sign a pledge about their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, I think, and we'll get to this in a little later too, there's sort of larger questions about policing the morals of writers. So even when the texts themselves are not problematic, so to speak, there was a great controversy, as I'm sure you know, about Blake Bailey's Philip Roth biography being pulped when his own sexual past was revealed. So these are some of the kinds that are swirling around us on both sides. And so the first thing I want to ask our panelists today is about, do you think these are just two, as it were, equal sides of one coin, or is there a qualitative difference between these? I mean, both sides of these efforts to control what appears in books or the kinds of books that are made accessible to especially children are ostensibly efforts to protect them in some way from the content that is considered harmful, although obviously each side has a very different idea of what's harmful. So can one look at this as a sort of, as I say, just two equal sides of a coin, or is there another way to think about it? Does anybody want to jump in? I feel like I always say this in class. Does anybody want to jump in, or am I going to call on somebody? Julian?
Sure. Well, first, I think it is important to draw a distinction between the right-wing campaigns to ban books, which have involved, you know, threats of violence against librarians and you know, an organized kind of state-by-state campaign to transform syllabi with a very concrete purpose of re-engineering the culture of the country, as much as that side likes to talk about cultural engineering through syllabi. And I don't think that there's necessarily an equivalence between that and a lot of critiques of canonical works on the left. I will say that I do think there is some overlap, and where I see it is, I think it's as much about how people read and are taught to read as what they read. Mm-hmm. I think across the political spectrum, we've sort of fallen into a situation where we've taken a logic that is maybe applicable to mass market entertainment or to advertising, where, you know, the criterion is, are people from a particular group being shown in a positive light? Are behaviors that we think are positive for society being modeled, and that's the criterion of whether or not a book is good or bad. So something that really concerned me that I saw lately when I was on Goodreads, which is not some, I don't recommend reading Goodreads reviews just promiscuously, but I was reading the Goodreads reviews of one of my favorite novels, Maurice Condé's Segu, a great historical epic about the Mali Empire, and also a great feminist novel about the way that patriarchy functioned in early 19th century Mali. And there were all of these one-star reviews that were basically saying there's a rape depicted in this novel, and the character who commits it is he's basically, people were complaining that Condé does not draw horns on this character, essentially, that he's a kind of complex human being, and there are actually consequences for his actions, but this sweeping historical epic with this character who has many dimensions is reduced to, as though just depicting this act in the book, which she was actually doing to illustrate the patriarchal nature of the society that he grew up in, it was just being reduced to showing that act itself was somehow a reason that this book shouldn't be taught.
Go ahead, Laura.
I think it's also important to make a distinction between the dynamics that drive criticism and censorship. And I think when you look at those, a right-left distinction doesn't quite make sense. Because if you look at censorship from the right, it's being organized by very disciplined activist groups like Moms for Liberty that have networks that cover the country, are closely connected to the Republican Party, and have a very clear plan of action for showing up at school board meetings and going to local town meetings to talk about defunding libraries. And they're targeting individuals, like Julian said, like targeting individual librarians and teachers. If you look at some of the more prominent cases of censorship or changing texts that do not come from the right, though I would not say come from the left, they're largely coming from corporations. Roald Dahl, the recent proposed sensitivity changes to the Roald Dahl books came not from a grassroots campaign anywhere at all, not from the left, not really from anyone. The changes were proposed by in-house sensitivity readers that were hired by a corporation called the Roald Dahl Story Company. And the precipitating event for that was, again, not a social movement, not some kind of public outcry, or even critical engagement with Roald Dahl, which has been going on for decades. But the fact that this company was preparing for a sale of their whole body of intellectual property to Netflix. And so they were basically doing up their house and making sure that it was as attractive and unproblematic as possible so that it could be a shiny corporate entity. So I think there is a false equivalence there. I think some of the craziness that goes on Goodreads is sadly not astroturfed, but it's very, very different from an organized and very powerful group like Moms for Liberty. And so I think we are dealing with two different kinds of thing.
Francine?
I mean, I'm going to say something which is probably so obvious that it hardly needs to be said, but I really don't think that any of it has to do with protecting children or protecting young people, because if it was about that, the effort would be put into gun control instead of banning books in the library. So what I do think is going on is that it has absolutely no relation to content. I mean, I hate this word content, but I just used it. To content or what's in the books. I mean, I think if we were to ask Ron DeSantis how many of his books he's read, it would be like, 0. I mean, I hate to sound like the most pessimistic person in the room, but it's begun to seem to me that all of these things, the book banning, the book censorship, and so forth, are trial balloons in a certain way. They have to do with power and they have to do with politics. And in the same way, I mean, I'm not making this false. I mean, it's a false equivalent, but in the same way that the Nazis used the euthanasia program as a trial balloon for the extermination camps, in the same way that they used book burning, the burning of books by certain writers and thinkers as a trial balloon for the persecution and arrest of those writers and thinkers. I think that is part of what's going on, at least on the right. On the left, there's something else going on, which is they feel themselves under tremendous threat from the right, which is just a fact. And so there's this attempt and you know, diversity and inclusion is absolutely necessary. I mean, absolutely important. But the kind of the finding of text problematic and the rewriting of canon, instead of creating a group of people who are tough, who are prepared to withstand the threats that's coming from right, they are creating a group of people, starting with the young and moving all the way up, who think of themselves as extremely fragile, extremely easily damaged, completely unprepared to deal with what is going to happen, with what's going to happen. So that there's two forces that are working kind of with and against each other in certain ways, and not for the good, I should say.
So, but, I mean, the question is, so Francine and I both teach at Bard College, and we've had, do you teach someplace? Have you?
Guest teach sometimes.
Guest teach. And so, I mean, this is a thing that comes up, right? So I want to ask two questions. I'm already going off book, which is great because I can't even see the book. But what do you do? What do we do about these old books with different worldviews from ours? I mean, is there a, you know, when is it legitimate to, well, I have to say in the context of what you were just saying, Francine, it is about, or at least ostensibly about, protecting the children, right? Because the children themselves say there are words they can't see, there are texts they can't see, there are famous controversies, for example, and this goes back to something Julian was saying just now about the Goodreads. So the famous controversy about Columbia and whether the Ovid's Metamorphoses needs to have trigger warnings on it because it's frequent, and this is a fact, right? It's frequent representations of violence against women. So what actually do we, you know, I think there's an impulse on both sides to sort of sweep aside some of these kinds of complaints as just being preposterous but I mean, what are we actually supposed to do? I mean, how do we deal with this when there are real issues and real sensitivities? I've been with my older son, I've been reading Dickens for years, and we have meetings every Sunday night over the phone, and we talk about our chapters. And then, I hadn't remembered from earlier readings of Dickens how often the word Jew comes up as clearly a pejorative way of referring to someone. And I think, okay, what do you do about, so what do we do about that, actually? Or how do you deal with it? I'm not saying there's anything that we can legislate, but it is a matter of sensitivities, and is one ever in a position to say you're being over-sensitive? You see what I mean?
I think you teach those books that have stood the test of time, and you also teach the critiques of them. So, one of the best classes I've ever taken was when I was in high school at Montclair High School with Helen Carrillo, if anyone out here knows her, but she taught us Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, but she didn't just teach us Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. We also read Chinua Achebe's great essay that was a critique of it and the way that it represented Africans even as it was protesting what had happened in the Congo in the late 19th century. We went through a syllabus that was really very much canonical, but that had works that were answering these books, and that importantly, the critiques were not just of what was represented in the books, but it drew out the way that their structure and their language and the literary elements of these books contributed to the worldviews that they created. And I think that people who want to stop teaching, for instance, in the American context, like Uncle Tom's Cabin or Huckleberry Finn or something, you're also going to run into the problem that how are you going to understand African American literature without teaching those books? How are you going to understand Richard Wright's books? Uncle Tom's Children was his first story collection. So many of these problematic books just formed the cultural context of the society we live in and the language that we speak. Even if your impulse is to reject them, that they formed the worldviews of people who found ways to criticize them and transcend them. So.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, can I make a book recommendation, since this is a book festival? There's a book coming out, I think early this winter, called James by Percival Everett. Some of you may have heard of this book already. And it's Huckleberry Finn rewritten from Jim's point of view. And it's a masterpiece, and it's brilliant, and it's funny, and it's heartbreaking, and it really makes you rethink. I mean, the running joke through the book is that when the slaves get together, they speak perfectly eloquent grammatical English. But when they're around white people, they speak the way they speak in Huckleberry Finn. And there's a scene where Jim is teaching a bunch of kids and explaining why they have to talk that way around white people. So I feel that next fall when I teach, I want to teach Huckleberry Finn alongside James. And there are a number of books like that you can teach together and say this is, plus I don't think it's is or should be beyond students' capabilities to understand this is the way people talk, this is the way people thought. We don't like it, we try not to think that way. There are still people who think that way. What are we going to do about it? And I think some of what's going on is a kind of, I see it as a kind of disrespect for the intelligence of students, for the capabilities of students, that they're tougher. I mean, I had a student tell me that she couldn't read a book. There's a book called Into That Darkness, which is about the Treblinka extermination. She couldn't read it because she was triggered by the Holocaust. And it was all I could do not to just, well, anyway. But it happened. It happened. Slavery happened. Racism happened. It happens, and they can't. I think it's unfair to them and belittling to them to think that we have to shield them from it.
Yeah, you've both spoken about, I think, teaching at the college level, and you can expect quite a lot from people of that age. I think it's possibly more complicated with younger children, though when I was reading about the Roald Dahl controversy, I kind of thought back to reading those books myself as a child in the 1990s, and I understood that when he was describing how like all women are secretaries or homemakers, that this was a historical perspective, that this was not referring to the world around me, that the books had been written several decades earlier, and that this was a fictional world that was cartoonish and that didn't reflect the reality in the 1990s. And I think most kids get that. I think there is a tendency to underestimate even very small children for their ability to read a book and understand that it's not describing the world that's right in front of them. It's like another place. That's why they're reading it. It's fiction.
Or even to detect that it's propaganda.
Yeah, like lots of kids hate those books.
One of my most pivotal reading experiences when I was young was actually this terrible series, the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind. These big fat fantasy novels, and I wasn't very politically sophisticated when I started reading them, but I realized basically that they were libertarian propaganda without really having words for that, just because they were kind of extolling individual selfishness, and everything that had to do with collectivity and solidarity was evil and violent, and I think people make assumptions that books just by depicting a certain thing are going to influence children in a certain way, but like your experience with Roald Dahl, like mine with Goodkind, children are a lot more sophisticated than we give them credit for.
I think there's also a very strange assumption that if someone presents you with a book, and especially if they're teaching it to you, it's incumbent on you to like the book and appreciate and praise it. And a really important part of being a good reader is disliking things and finding out why you dislike them and arguing with them and arguing with people who have a different perspective. It's not something that you're meant to just absorb and, accept whole cloth. Rejecting stuff is part of being a good reader.
Yeah, the one word that I won't allow my students to use in class is relatable. Because it's not about them. It's not about them, and the books aren't mirrors. You're not supposed to see yourself necessarily. I mean, sometimes it's helpful to see someone who's like you, someone who looks like you, someone who thinks like you, but it's not a necessity. It's absolutely, sometimes you read a book to find about people who are completely unlike you in some other place.
I mean, it is interesting, though, and I think the point that you were making, Laura, is an interesting one, that most of the controversies about books that are taught are not about college level teaching. They are about really middle school texts. And it is interesting that the pressure that is exerted comes right now mostly from parents in a way that is different. So when I was sort of looking through a bunch of material in preparation for this afternoon, I was really electrified by the fact that when I sort of was typing keywords in, that a lot of the articles that came up were from the 1980s, and those of you who remember the culture wars back in after the election of Reagan, the same exact things were happening, right? There was a tremendous monitoring of requests for banning books. There was a definite movement, to come back to a point that Laura was making, a sort of orchestrated, politicized movement to ban books, to sort of create this sort of atmosphere of culture wars around certain titles that were perceived as, the books that were perceived as being immoral, obscene, and too negative. I don't know why that always cracks me up. I thought, well, it's like, I want a symphony in a major key, So, so that I think is interesting, because to come back, Francine, we talk about this a lot between the two of us because of things that have come up. And yes, at the college age, you can teach the critique along with the text, and that will, I'm sure 95% of students would be receptive. But when you're talking about younger children, where most of the controversy is actually centered on what's going on in public schools, middle schools, it becomes much harder. Well, here's an interesting fact that I just read about, which is percentage-wise, to come back to the point you were making about Goodreads. So percentage-wise, I think like 60% of requests about book ban, people who want to ban a certain book, they say that it is about sexual content of some kind that middle school children should not be exposed to. But 60% of the books that are actually banned successfully are about violence or what they call well-being issues, so people struggling with addiction. I think that split, I was sort of fascinated by that split, and that's why I got this idea about protecting the children. Clearly somebody thinks that the children needs to be protected, and I do think it's a more vexed issue, honestly, so I don't know. I mean, at that point, what do you do? It's more, I had access to school libraries when I was growing up on Long Island in the 60s and 70s. As far as I know, things weren't banned, and that's more or less how I learned about everything, including sex. I remember my parents arguing one night about who should tell me, and my father said, "Let them learn it on the streets the way I did." So I guess what is fundamentally behind this is whether they should know about this stuff. It's right?
But they do. I remember, we couldn't find anything, but some of us, there's a lot of sex in the Bible. And actually, there's been some efforts to ban the Bible in Utah, I believe, and I remember me and my friends paging through the Old Testament for the dirty parts. So, and no one at that point thought of, but I think,
it is, I do think, right, that there is possibly one could see how, I don't know, an 11-year-old, I'm trying to put myself in the mind of a person who's thinking this way, that you don't want your 11-year-old reading about, I don't know, violent rape, or I don't know.
Your 11-year-old's not going to become a violent rapist because he or she read the book.
No, I don't think that's the issue, but is it going to be is it material that an 11-year-old cannot assimilate, let's say?
I think there are two points to answer that. I don't want to dismiss the idea completely that there's nothing that one could read that could be harmful. Perhaps there is. But the first thing is that if you're learning about violent rape, you're probably not going to be learning about it from a book first. If you turn on the TV or play a video game or read the news, that's where you're going to be primarily exposed to depictions of violence and sex.
Right.
Learning about it via book, I think, is a more mediated experience, partly because you have to do a lot of intellectual work to access those depictions. You have to actually read and understand and read between the lines, and I think that's a much more protected way to find out about these things. The second is, if there is so much concern for the children, then why hasn't anyone gone through the decades of data we have on decades of children who've been exposed to these books in libraries? Because most of the books being challenged are books like Toni Morrison that have been around forever. They're mostly not new books. And show some children whose lives were damaged by reading those books. I haven't heard of a single case.
Right, it's like, who was it, the comedian who said, until somebody goes into a school and beats 6 children to death with a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, I think you're worried about the wrong stuff. Right.
Right.
You know, yeah. I mean, it is interesting that, as far as I am aware, there are not great numbers of calls for bans of virtually every television program. I mean, I know that there are people who are. So again, the fact that, is this a manufactured, controversy? And Francine was touching on that earlier, right? This is as it was in the 80s, which some of us remember well, the whole culture wars thing at the beginning of the 80s under Reagan, was it politically manufactured? If the student psychologists can deal with it, if the middle school kids are either oblivious or they've already seen everything and they can't, so who is actually worried and why are they worried is the question that needs to be addressed, because the question that one needs to pose, right, is these things are happening for whatever reasons, either specious or genuine, they are happening, and the question for people like us is what do you do, right? This is a real thing. What the reasons are, this is happening. There are these calls to ban books. So how does one approach it? One of the questions that I had written down was, how is this affecting each of you in your own work? I mean, these kinds of considerations. I mean, how is it affecting you as writers, as editors, in the way that, as teachers, also Francine, right? How is it affecting these considerations, the awareness that we're living in this incredibly charged atmosphere? Is it affecting you? How are you trying to do something about it? I'd be very interested to hear.
Well, this is just my own character, but I always feel, this is just my own character, but I always feel at least every semester to put 1 or 2 books on the syllabus that I know trouble, and that I know will be, and then just try and be as truthful as possible, and that I know will be, and then just try and be as truthful as possible. I mean, for example, my students about how I feel about it. The Marquise of O by Heinrich von Kleist. I mean, for example, one of my favorite books, which the Marquise of O by Heinrich von Kleist, which is one of my favorite. But it's about a woman which is I raped another book recommendation. But it's about a woman who is not only persuaded to marry her rapist, but by the end of the book are not only persuaded to marry her rapist, but we, the readers, which is not something by the end of the novella are going to get over it and marry, which is not something I have my students to believe. But it's interesting to talk about the way that neither do my students. But it's interesting to talk about the way that a writer, and it makes them think. I mean, for whatever reason, that's our responsibility. And it makes them think. I mean, that's A, to make them love literature. That's our responsibility. And B, to help it. A, to make them love literature, however we can. And B, to help something that's happened in this country. I mean, just to go on for one more second. I think that one thing that's happened in this country, starting in the 80s, starting with the Reagan Bush years, there's been an on purpose effort to dismantle the educational system.
Sure.
On purpose, and it's not
I
accidental. You have a whole army, only don't educate, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that's lost is the ability to think logically, can't, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that's lost is the ability to think logically. So it's illogical to think that your kid is going to read a book about. So it's illogical to think that your kid is going to read a book about.
Well, I can say from personal experience that one's sexuality cannot be changed by exposure to books, because everything I read was straight, and somehow it still happened. I don't know why it's never supposed to work the other way. So every person in my generation saw straight movies, straight commercials, read straight books in class. Every example was always straight. We came out gay anyway. But however, if one straight child reads, Heather's Two Mommies, they're going to join dykes on bikes, I don't see how that's supposed to work.
Yeah.
Francine, I should say, is famous at Bard for courses with titles like, Despicable Books or,
Strange.
strange.
Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. But that is the fear that you hear. They're trying to make our children gay. That's what you hear coming from these parents who are trying to. And illogical is the least of it. It's ridiculous. But that's, again, if you can think, you don't think that.
I want to go back to something Laura said in this context, which is just that why are we so afraid of books and in the context of children's safety? Because they're the most mediated experience you could have. You have to actually use your imagination. And I think that that's maybe why books are so threatening to people who are concerned about what children are thinking about, because it actually does give young people a bit of distance to think about things that might be disconcerting or that might contravene the social circumstances that they're in, challenge the kind of world around them in a way that images and multimedia might not provide that same kind of distance. So I think that's maybe why the very fact that it's actually less threatening in terms of traumatizing people might be why it's more threatening as something that could be taught.
I also think there's a big part of this that isn't about books as books
Yes.
at all.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, Francine, the attack on books also converges very powerfully with an attempt to dismantle public services in this country. Libraries are some of the few places that most people will have a positive interaction with their local government, where they'll be able to receive services, whether that's getting books or help finding a job, working on their resume, somewhere to go that's not their house or a store. And one of the effects of these bills in places like Florida and also in Michigan is to overwhelm libraries with book banning requests and to impose the obligation on institutions to review every single title in their catalog, which for places that are already really underfunded is basically completely impossible ask. The point is to completely overwhelm them and basically shut them down. My colleague Melissa Gira-Grant, who's reported on this, wrote about a library in Michigan where the librarian refused to ban a book that was being challenged, that was part of one of these activist campaigns, and then the town voted to completely defund the library. So the effect of that is like, yes, you've withdrawn access to all these books, but you've also taken away a pillar of this community and taken away so many other services. And I think that is why book banning is so appealing to the right, for people who do not care about books, do not care about what kids are reading, certainly don't care that they can go turn on Netflix the minute they get home and see much more disturbing stuff.
Right.
They want to shrink the government, and this is a really effective way of doing it.
I think that's a really interesting point. I want to come back to, or come off of a point that Julian was making. So one of the quotes that I gathered, which is worth straining to read because it goes very much to this issue of, which I think, we've sort of evolved over the past 40 minutes, this, that it's not about children's safety, it's about fear that children will actually think. That's the real issue, and that's why it's more scary to me. So one of the quotes from, there was a piece in the Times the other day that said actually there are like 11 parents who were responsible for 60% of the requests to ban, and one of them wrote, so there's a book called Black Brother, which is a coming-of-age story that follows these two brothers and their experiences with racism, and if it weren't so sad, it would be funny. The challenger wrote that she was afraid that the books would make students begin to question whether race plays a role in every interaction. That was her fear. So I think, that's why this it seems to me that that's why this is so charged, because the driving, I mean, yes, it's practical at a political level in the way that Laura has elucidated, and I do think there's an orchestrated, part of this is an orchestrated attempt, not just to shrink government, I would say, but to sort of strike at what is perceived as the elite intellectual activity with material tools, to dismantle the material means that the perceived elite uses to educate its children, blah, blah, blah. But there is an ideological struggle, finally, that is underneath this, which is to prevent American students from thinking intelligently about American history. I mean, it's not accidental that so many of the texts that at issue here, or not just the text, but we've talked also about the teaching of critical race theory, which is now, people want to ban the teaching of critical race theory, get professors who teach it to be subject to tenure review and firing, So this is about perpetuating a fantasy of what American history is, as opposed to having children be intelligently informed about what American history is. I don't know if anyone has seen that video. I think it was authentic, about the Florida educational video that was produced, that this is what Florida wants. It's a cartoon. And in the cartoon, the ghost of Frederick Douglass is telling, has anyone seen this? It's all over the place. Pardon? Oh. And it was the ghost of Frederick Douglass is telling these two white school children that, yes, slavery was a terrible thing, but they shouldn't feel bad about it because they had nothing to do with it and it happened before their time. So I'm going to wrap up our part because I see the time has been flying during this interesting conversation. I know people will have questions and things, but one does have to recognize the extent of the ideological fervor that is, I think, clearly behind a good deal of this activity, and that is linked to these other sort of epiphenomena, like the one that Laura was mentioning. So on that cheery note, I'm sure people have questions and things like that. We've got about 15 minutes. I think, is the idea that people will come up to the microphone? Yeah, if you can maybe just stand, and I'll repeat the questions back just to make sure. Yeah.
I think I can use a big voice. I was teaching PhD, so I remember the first wave of this. And I think one thing that wasn't mentioned, I was reading here at Culture and Culture, is the point is it is political and it is about destroying trust. So if you think about librarians, elementary school teachers, those are the people that parents wish to trust. And if you get any kind of wedge, that destroys it because parents are thinking they're not doing a logical thing. And I think critical race theory is the same way, that they've gotten in there that you're going to make the child feel big. So I think that Francine's point is it is about destroying our expectations. And when I heard it coming up, I thought this is incredibly clever and it has the ability to
That's a very interesting. Anybody want to react to that? So this lady was saying that as a person who had experiences of this back starting in the 80s, that the point of what is being done institutionally is to destroy the child student's trust in the librarian, in the teacher. And so again, it's consistent with this desire to disintegrate the fabric on which intelligent and constructive education takes place, so that the people who used to be trusted, I remember going to school and the school librarian was this sort of august person, so it's an intentional campaign.
correction. I think children always know intuitively who to trust. It's the parents. They're going after the parents.
Yeah.
Parents are a group that if you're not in there first, they scare you.
Yes, and it is, and that's consistent. The point that was just added on about that the parents are targeted by these groups, and we've seen that the emergence of, I can't remember the name, but Laura, you mentioned it, that parents group.
Moms for Liberty.
Yes, right. Moms for Liberty is incredibly powerful organizations. And it's actually, one of the statistics that I read was that I think 87% of districts in which some kind of ban had successfully been enacted were within very close physical proximity to an office or a headquarters of one of these kinds of groups. But part of, I think, the phenomena of the targeting of parents was a kind of epiphenomenon of COVID, because for the first time, or not the first time, but parents were being involved and exposed to what their kids were being taught, because everybody was together all the time and we're all on the Zoom watching the kids, and I think that also has a lot to do with it. Other questions and comments? Yes, here and then in the back.
Hi, I was wondering, the pandemic has substantially affected younger students and their critical reading skills, and years lost literally for really young students that are eventually going to age into high school, into college. We've discussed so much about adults having issues with books, but what happens when students themselves, especially younger students that aren't receiving the correct whatever education, how does that affect your job as educators? How does that affect your job as editors for a population of students that are eventually going to get older and interact with books in not necessarily a way that means that they have a full education to understand those ideas? Like, is that gap ever going to be filled? I don't know.
So the question is about the education gap that has resulted from COVID and what the potential ramifications are. You know, as we know, there's evidence that students, you know, middle school, elementary school students aren't learning how to read as well, and there's going to be some kind of an effect about this, of what kind of people, what kind of readers, I guess, we're going to have. I don't know, does anybody have a thought about that?
Well, as a writer who doesn't teach, I feel like we do have some role to play in this, but it's a kind of sad prospect, the idea of having to adjust the way one writes about literature to accommodate the fact that people have not been educated in it as much as they have in the past. I mean, I do think with the deterioration of the way people read, and particularly just assuming that kind of books are about celebrating what certain characters do and validating certain identities rather than things that are meant to be read with suspicion and all of your kind of critical faculties awake. There's not a lot we can do as editors and writers. I do think eventually there's going to have to be some kind of counter movement among people who love books to protect curricula and protect education in books around the country. Unfortunately, it's not quite as, it's easier to destroy trust than it is to build it. I mean, the rallying cry of people are trying to recruit our children into homosexuality or make them ashamed to be American, or that's something that grabs people so powerfully. The idea of just being open-minded and learning literature, that's a lot more difficult to propagandize for, because it is kind of anti-propagandistic. But somehow we have to find a way to do it, because I don't think there's an alternative other than fighting on that terrain of libraries and schools, because that's kind of the foundation.
Well, I would also, if I can just put my own 2 cents in for a second, and it's not just because I'm a critic, but I do think that, I mean, we're 4 writers here. Laura's the literary critic of the New Republic. I mean, criticism is a very strong tool in this fight, it seems to me. I mean, because you have to have something that is professional and at a high level that keeps the intelligent discussion about books intelligent, and that gives people access to actual arguments and not just the Goodreads the Goodreads approach, and I think that's very important. So, I mean, as far as what we can do, that's all that we can do, but it's important to keep it going. There was a gentleman at the back. Yes, sir.
I was just going to point out that this isn't a hopeless case. I live in Houston, Texas. It took 2 booksellers, one in Houston, one in Austin, to get a book banning law in Texas banned by the federal court. But it took will. And what you just said about our inability to fight this, I think is completely wrong. I think it has been a lack of will on part of our community to fight this, because it does work, and I can tell you firsthand, I was in the courtroom when that happened. So
But
would
am I
implore
wrong?
that you rethink some of those passivities that we just heard.
Am I wrong in thinking or having read or having written about that many public schools in Houston have taken away their libraries, public school libraries, and replaced them with detention centers for students who misbehave? This is a fact, who
No,
misbehave.
that was one administrator who has proposed to do that in problematic schools in the district. I mean, the city is the same size as Brooklyn, so that was not what parents want to do. I say that as a parent of a teenager in Houston. So
Right.
this was.
Well, I think there are probably a lot of very vigorous.
Is there more that can be done with this community rather than just saying, well, all we can do is write about it? Because it took booksellers and it took a commercial argument to get that banned. So.
I just wanted to clarify, I was not at all what I was saying that we can't do anything to fight this. In fact, what I was saying is I think we do have to take this fight to schools and libraries. I was responding specifically to the idea that critics and writers can somehow fix this situation without actual political action. Like, I don't think there's a way to write about books in magazines and newspapers that is just going to undo the kind of deprivation of reading education that has taken place over the last few years.
Right. There's a, yes.
Hi, I just wanted to go back to a point that Lara made earlier about the role of politics. Hi, I just wanted to go back about publishers on Lara made earlier. I've heard a lot of stories about publishers' roles in editions. I've heard a lot of stories that his book wasn't censored enough about them. And my understanding is that there's a lot of publishers that are very cautious right now about publishing. Is that there's a lot of publishers that are very cautious about strategy. I wonder what you do for the right. I've heard there's kind of pushback against strategy.
So the question is about, there have been these cases where publishers have backed off from publishing certain kinds of things out of fears of certain kinds of reactions. And so, well, I think the Blake Bailey thing was a good example of that, where the biographer of Philip Roth had the book pulped, and it wasn't anything in the book, it was just something about the writer. So is there anything to be done about that?
I do actually think that someone should correct me or look this up. I don't think the book was popped. The copies that remained, that had been printed, which I think was several thousand, remained in circulation and were continued to be for sale. It just wasn't sent to another print run, which is also not good and not something I would recommend, but it wasn't actually popped. And it was also immediately picked up by a second publisher. So that book has been continually for sale in the United States. To the point you made, I think these questions are really tricky. I'm not a book editor, and the kinds of conversations that you're describing happen behind closed doors, and you only really hear about them through anecdotes like this, through authors who are willing to share their experiences with other authors. I think critics do have a really important role to play in sustaining the health of the conversations that happen publicly, so that at least authors have something to point to if they are trying to advocate for the way they've written to their editors, to say, hey, well, here's a really great essay about the way these things are discussed that you should consider, if we're discussing how my book's gonna look. So I think that a robust critical engagement definitely helps in those situations. I think that part of the conversation is kind of different to the right-wing book ban stuff, just that you're talking about works in progress and you don't know where they're going to end up, versus the right having kind of sweeping bans on things that have been available for many years.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
I think college instructor, Shakespeare's instructor, Shakespeare's plays, Midsummer's featuring Shakespeare. I just have a comment on Shakespeare's play. I think Midsummer is the issue of much. I just have a comment, that I think living in America behind the issue of that much larger, culture wars, living in America more true than before. So behind you is the seal of Brooklyn. It says "I doth not." So behind you is the seal of Brooklyn. That means says "I doth not" brings strength. That means unity. The reason that's there is because Dutch history. The reason that's there is because 1626 Dutch history. Dutch 1620 America. They have a statue. It's one of the statues outside. There's also the Henry Ward picture statue. They have a statue. Now when you said culture. That don't just understand that. My point is philosophical culture, the ability that you must understand important issues. I'm not on one of those sources saying that I'm not one important issue. I'm not in one book. Maybe so much in need of issue books. Better understand. Maybe so much they are there. And it's hard to understand. They are there.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you, everybody.